Welcome to this edition of When the Biomass Hits the Wind Turbine, a discussion of sustainable living and what that means to you and me. I'm Jay Warmke.
I'm Annie Warmke.
And today we're going to talk about the Battle of the Currents, or
was Tesla smarter than Edison?
Tesla smart. Yeah, this is part of the Dead White Scientists series where we go into some of the history of sustainability, and I will answer that question, yes. Okay, that's the end of this program. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, we came right to the end. Forget the middle.
Right. So what was the Battle of the Currents? Some people, this may be a familiar thing. For other people, it's way out there. But if we put ourselves back 100, 120 years ago, when electricity was a new thing, basically we're in this battle. There was DC currents, and Thomas Edison, with the perfection of, or the marketing of, the incandescent light bulb, and he did not invent the
Is it perfection or refining?
It was neither perfection. I'm sure he refined it, but he made it commercially
Right,
commercially
because he didn't
viable.
really invent it.
No, it was about 100 years old when he got a hold of it. Well, what you were dealing with was the incandescent light bulb used DC low voltage.
Electricity.
Electricity. And there was arc lighting, high voltage AC electricity that was outdoors. So as they started bringing electricity into homes, there was this battle, this tension between AC, DC, which was effectively Nikola Tesla, who perfected the delivery of AC power, and Thomas Edison, who was creating the grid with DC power. And it's important to know these two powers work differently. And Annie, you warned me not to get all geekish about how DC works, how AC works.
Yeah.
But I'm going to tell you, DC electricity, you can think of it like water flowing through a pipe, water flowing through a hose. The electrons start at one end and they end up at the other end. AC electricity provides power almost like, you remember those old toys where you had those swinging balls and you swing one ball into the other ball and the other ball would go? The balls didn't move, but the energy from the ball made the last ball move. That's how AC power moves. It's like clacking balls. The balls actually vibrate back and forth, and it is the motion of them that creates that energy. So the electrons don't actually move through a pipe. So anyway, they're totally different things.
Thanks. Okay, now we know
That's
that.
all we need to know. Yeah. So a lot of this came to a head when they were trying to figure out how to tap into the energy at Niagara Falls and transport it all the way to Buffalo, New York.
A total of 30 miles.
Yeah,
huh?
about 30 miles,
Wow.
29 miles and some change, which was a huge distance at that time for DC, because DC would only go like hundreds of feet or even maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet effectively before you started losing voltage. Because as electricity flows through power lines, it loses some of its voltage, a little bit like the friction of water, on the side of the pipe. You lose a little of the pressure. Well, with AC, you could use transformers, and these transformers were developed in Europe. In fact, one of the guys who created the transformer was a fellow named Stanley, who later went on to invent the thermos.
Oh, I was going to say Stanley steamer cleaners.
No, it was Stanley. And in fact, his son or grandson, I don't remember which, teamed up with J.P. Morgan's son or grandson. And they made Morgan Stanley Bank. So they're all related.
Once rich, always rich.
It's like a small town in Appalachia. Everybody's related to each other.
Oh, that was low.
But anyway, Lord Kelvin, who was very instrumental in the early days of electricity, was a big proponent of DC electricity.
So he was like an important physicist or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the Kelvin temperature scale is based on and all of that. But he was like a big proponent of Edison's system until he went to the World's Fair and he saw, or the Chicago Exposition, and he saw the AC lighting, and then he was like, whoa, man, this is the future. So when they did award this contract, that was a big step to giving it to Westinghouse. And Westinghouse won the contract. Well, that didn't set very well.
What was Westinghouse? You haven't explained.
Oh, I haven't. Well, Tesla went to work for Westinghouse.
It was a company and a man.
Yeah. George Westinghouse.
Okay.
And George owned the company Westinghouse Electric. And so they became one of the major competitors. There were actually 3 companies out there that were vying to be the electric companies. There was Edison Electric, Westinghouse Electric, and then there was another one. I've got it in my notes here somewhere, but I can't remember what it is. Anyway, a third company. And so the two companies were opting for AC electricity. Edison was opting for DC. And the technologies were such that AC was superior. And so Edison started losing out. Edison, not being apparently a very nice person.
Or a good loser.
Yeah, or a good loser. He began a PR campaign. And with the help of an engineer named Harold Brown, this guy seemed obsessed with how dangerous AC electricity was. So he started going around from town to town. And Edison was kind of funding this behind the scenes. But Brown would go out there and he would get kids to bring stray dogs up and he would electrocute them.
Oh, that's
And he
horrible.
would show, okay, we're going to give them a shock with DC. Look, see, they didn't die. Now we're going to give them a shock with AC. Look, see, they just died.
But he's lying, really.
Well,
Because if you get shocked by DC,
it can kill you.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, some of the arguments there, Westinghouse was going, well, you know what? You shocked him with the DC first. Now he's pretty weak.
yeah.
And then you give him the AC and then you kill him. Okay,
Yeah.
that doesn't prove anything. So there was a lot of this kind of controversy. In fact, Harold Brown claimed that there were multiple deaths from AC. He claimed, in fact, that AC had killed 30 people over the last year. Where Electrical Engineering magazine investigated that, found the number was really closer to 2. So it's still dangerous, but not as dangerous
I
as
think
was
more
being
that it
posted.
was burning houses down. And
Well,
stuff.
that was a big problem, a minor problem. And actually, this is one of those kind of things where Westinghouse came out and said, hey, you know what, but trolley cars killed like 130 people last year. And that's kind of a weak argument because you go, well, they're still all dead. It's still bad.
I know, it's terrible.
So this was, but it was really a PR campaign thing, where they were out there trying to convince people that the other person's product was dangerous. And this got to a head when the state of New York decided they were going to use electrocution as a humane way to kill criminals. So they began construction of the very first electric chair.
Which Mr. Edison supported, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. But he supported that it be AC electric because he wanted, once again, to use this as an example of how dangerous AC
instead
is.
of the DC.
So there is some evidence that Edison actually paid for the electric chair to be manufactured. And they, as part of the whole spin campaign, tried to come up with a term for it. And they talked about it, the one that they were really pushing for was to be Westinghoused if you get electrocuted,
Wow. So they're going to put him out of business.
Well, that's spin doctor stuff. And they ultimately ended up on being electrocuted, which everybody felt was kind of a weak term. They really wanted to associate it with a name, and Westinghouse was the one they kept putting forward. Now, as part of this, they developed a story, this is later, that Edison, in fact, electrocuted an elephant. And I hear this all the time when we talk about the battle of the currents. Okay, they were going around, they were electrocuting dogs, they were electrocuting cats, they were doing all of this stuff, and it got so bad that in New York City they actually electrocuted an elephant. That's the way the story goes, and it's always portrayed as Edison was such an evil fellow that he actually brought out an elephant. Well, the real story, actually, and this gets back to what we talk about, how everything you ever learned in school is wrong. It's always not necessarily. I should say it's always not necessarily. Okay, let's be positive. It's never the truth. But there was a elephant, and this elephant's name was. I lost track of it. Anyway, the name of it doesn't matter. Anyway, this elephant was electrocuted, but it had killed
Topsy.
Topsy. That's so cute.
Topsy at Coney Island, no less.
Yeah. And it was a big story because Topsy, apparently his trainer was a drunk and was cruel to this elephant. And this elephant, of course, lashing out, killed 3 people. So the people at this park in Coney Island decided the elephant had to be put down. Well, it was sentenced to hang. Where
are they going to hang it?
I don't know.
Did anybody think that through?
Apparently
not. Maybe they thought it was a good PR thing.
But I guess cooler heads prevailed because they decided electrocution.
Oh, yeah, so much better.
But see, at the time, electrocution was a new thing and considered to be very painless compared to the alternatives.
Well, they should have had some people walk up there and try it out first.
Oh, well, that's, I guess, experimentation is
I would have much preferred that to the elephant being hung.
Anyway, but when this elephant had to be put down, it's like a rabid dog in this case, but it's, I mean, you could blame the trainer and they should have maybe electrocuted him, but they, but they decided
That's another story.
Yeah, they decided to electrocute the elephant. And so it was a matter of, it was AC electricity once again, and the argument was that that Edison was behind this. Well, he wasn't, although the Edison company apparently filmed it because it was a big story. It was a big news story. But see, this was 10 years after the Battle of the Currents, so it wasn't part of it.
It wasn't going to sell the story.
The narrative was such that. That it didn't happen that way, where the dogs were being executed and then they escalated it up to an elephant. This became part of the mythology well after the fact.
Did they electrocute Tesla so they could win?
I think, well, there are some pictures that Tesla was experimenting with electricity, but there's even evidence that was rigged. So,
what, that he was shocking himself?
Yeah, there were pictures of him surrounded by electrical bolts and all of that. But apparently he did a double exposure that made him sitting in his laboratory, and then he did an exposure of the electricity going around the laboratory. But he was a showman as well. I mean, he was big into that. So anyway, as part of this development, because AC electricity was a superior technology at this time, for transmitting electricity over longer distances. Because remember I said that some voltage gets lost as you transmit it? Right. Well, if you can elevate the electricity to, say, 1,000 volts, and you're still losing 10 volts, 10 from 1,000 is a lot smaller percentage than 10 from 12, like a DC system. If it's operating at 12 volts and you lose 10, you've lost almost all your electricity. So because you had these things called transformers, you could up and then lower the voltage. So transferring it over longer distances was more effective than DC. So a number of these companies evolved really by the end of 1887. Westinghouse had 68 power stations using AC. Edison had 121. But by the next year, we were starting to see those numbers begin to reverse themselves, where there were many more AC power stations out there than DC. And that's when Edison kind of ramped up the battle. His technology was losing. He wanted to fight back. Really, within about 2 years, we saw this whole battle of the currents start to diminish, not because it was won or lost in the argument, but essentially Edison retired. A new CEO took over Edison's company, bought the competing AC electric company, and switched everything over to AC, and then said, oh, by the way, all these things we said evil about AC, yeah, forget all that, because now it's all good. You are listening to When the Biomass Hits the Wind Turbine with Jay and Annie Warmke, coming to you from Studio B, WOUB Radio, reminding you once again it is the end of the world as we know it.
And thank God.
Thank God. Okay, so today we're talking about the Battle of the Currents and the fact that there was this battle between the AC and the DC and between Edison and Westinghouse. And basically by 1888, this Battle of the Currents was beginning to wind down. 1889 comes along, and there were a number of high-profile deaths that reignited the controversy. And it was
What's
called...
What's that mean, high-profile deaths?
Well, it was referred to in the newspapers as the electric wire panic. And basically, in Buffalo, New York, about 4 technicians were killed all in 1 year while working on electric lines. And one of them, there was a telegraph worker, and I think this was in New York City. He actually... he was working on the telegraph wire, which is supposed to be low voltage, but it was shorted out to a high voltage AC electric line, and he got electrocuted. But he was working right outside of City Hall, so he fell into the wires, he tangled all up, and his body was hanging there in front of City Hall for about an hour while they tried to get him down. And it was not a good PR situation for Westinghouse. So this started the whole controversy all over again. In Europe, they had settled a lot of this because they buried the wires. They put the wires underground. In America, in New York especially, they did not want to go to the expense of burying these wires. So Westinghouse and the other companies argued vehemently that no regulation was required, except people started dying. So they got into this whole PR battle, which is basically the battle of the currents. In fact, it began to cost them so much money, and there were so many lawsuits that Westinghouse was right on the verge of bankruptcy, at which point J.P. Morgan, the banker, decided he was going to take advantage of this situation, and he began manipulating the stock market, and he was going to take over the electric industry by forcing Westinghouse, forcing these other people out of business, and swooping in like a jackal and taking over. And the only thing that saved it was Tesla, who agreed essentially to tear up his patents on AC electricity and let them use it for free, which he lost about $1 trillion, they figure.
Well, so what would have been different if they hadn't won out and AC had remained the dominant electric?
AC became the dominant.
DC, sorry.
Well, DC was inherently, with its properties of 100 years ago, you would have had to have power stations just about every 1,000 feet. So electricity only would have been available in urban centers. It would have changed things dramatically. There would have been no rural electrification program. There would have been no electricity out of the very centers of towns. I often hear when we're talking about these things, why do we use AC electricity instead of DC electricity today? And people still will say, well, AC electricity travels better over long distances than DC does, which is not true. In fact, most of the high-powered electrical lines that are in the U.S. now that travel across the country are DC. And DC does actually travel better over longer distances. But it required the development of the computer, basically, to allow us to begin to change the voltage of DC the same way we were able to manipulate the voltage of AC back in the 1890s.
Could we do that now today with broadband?
With broadband.
Because, we just, rural America has such a bad time with that. We could just get some computer program that would suddenly transform something like DC.
Well, you can actually transmit data, broadband, over electric lines.
Yeah, but they're not doing it.
I know. Well, that's a different issue. That's just the motivation of the companies involved. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned that because Nikola Tesla, he became obsessed with how can he make this invention of his, AC electricity, safer. So he got into this mindset that if he could emulate the waveform of sunlight, get that frequency, get that kind of intensity, obviously sunlight didn't hurt people, didn't kill people. If he could transmit electricity wirelessly and at the same frequencies as sunlight, he would make AC safer. And in fact, he ended up inventing the radio as part of this. And I hear people out there listening at the moment saying, wait a minute. Tesla did not invent the radio. Well, au contraire, he did, right? And he actually patented it. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, Marconi, who is credited today with inventing the radio, it's assumed today he took many of Tesla's ideas and began to incorporate that into his radio production. And when he brought it over to the United States, he was infringing upon a number of Tesla's patents. Tesla didn't really seem to care. Tesla was one of these guys who he dearly wanted credit for his things, but he was not all that focused or that good at focusing on money. So he kind of let it slide until Marconi was awarded the Nobel Prize for inventing the radio, at which time Tesla pretty well freaked out and started suing him for infringement. And by then, Marconi had a bunch of money. Tesla did not have a bunch of money. The patent office had awarded it to Tesla, had reinforced that it was Tesla's patent, and then suddenly reversed it, gave it to Marconi, and booted Tesla out. Now, they never explained why, but the assumption of modern-day historians is somebody got paid something. And so money talked and Tesla walked in this case.
And didn't he sort of fight mental illness much of his life?
He did. He struggled with that, I think. I mean, obviously, he was, in his later years, the story goes he was living in a hotel, walking around feeding pigeons and muttering the number 3 over and over and over.
I feed pigeons.
Yeah, well, okay.
I don't mutter.
I rest my case. So.
I don't muddle. The number 3, I might talk to the refrigerator, though.
Well, and what was nice is Westinghouse agreed to pay his hotel room. Now, isn't that sweet? Since he had given him basically $1 trillion worth of and saved his company. So, but Tesla had this reputation at the time, and historically so, that he was unquestionably a genius, and they like to refer to him as thinking in 3 dimensions, which I think we all do. I hope, but
I don't think that's true at all. I wish more people did.
But he was bad with business. He never seemed to have money. He often bit off more than he could chew, and he was constantly in trouble there. He did fight in court. It wasn't until after he died that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in his favor that he was, in fact, the inventor of the radio. And speaking of...
but they don't teach that in school.
I know.
They say Mr. Marconi did it.
Well, they also say that Edison invented the light bulb, and they say that the Wright brothers were the first to fly. I mean, they say a lot of things that aren't true. But one thing that I found was quite interesting is when Tesla was trying to show his wireless products, here he had created radio. Well, one of the things he didn't, I don't think, really saw the voice part of radio being interesting.
What did he think it was going to do?
Remote control of machines. So he created this wireless boat. It was almost like a submarine, but he had this wireless boat that he controlled remotely.
Was it a full-size boat?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, I
wasn't
kid's
there. Boat. I mean, in those days
but that's still amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
And he was controlling it wirelessly. In 1898, here he had this wireless remote control boat, and one of the New York Times reporters was saying, this could be a missile or a torpedo could be put on this. You've created a weapon. This is terrible. And Tesla actually responded to him. The quote I read, it says, "You see here the first of a race of robots, mechanical men that will do the laborious work of the human race." So he was envisioning, 100 and some odd years ago, this idea of remote controlled robotics, which is, the guy, the more you study him, he had some mental health issues.
But maybe part of his mental health issues was the fact that he could see these things. A lot of us believe certain things and come to understand certain things about today's political life or how things work, and then people might call us crazy because we really can put all the pieces together and see what's possible.
Well, it's usually everything that is going to happen into the future is crazy the first time it's shown. I think it was a George Bernard Shaw quote that says, a reasonable person or a reasonable man adapts himself to his environment. An unreasonable man adapts the environment to himself. So all progress is made by unreasonable men. And that
And
makes
women.
sense. Yeah, well, George Bernard Shaw didn't care about women. Come on.
Oh, yes, he did.
I'm sure he
Actually,
probably actually did.
Yes, he did.
So this was the Battle of the Currents. Even something as mundane as why do we use AC electricity as DC has this amazing historical element associated with it that human stories and torturing of animals and people dying and battles and lawsuits and patent infringements and all of that. I just find that the human element of technology development is fascinating, especially since we never learn it.
Well, and it's too bad because I think these stories could really get young people interested in engineering and technology in a way that the old boring story does not, the untrue boring story. And I think that is a disservice because even though I'm not a geek and I'm not that keenly interested, I do like the gossip part of it. And sometimes that engages me in a way that I want to learn more. And if that works on me, it's definitely going to work on younger people who are sometimes actively seeking something to be keenly interested in instead of the same old kind of stuff.
Okay, so next time you're told that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, that Marconi invented the radio, that the Wright brothers invented the airplane, just look at the person and know. You don't have to say because they're not going to believe you anyway. That history is more complicated than that. One person builds upon another person's invention. They refine it. They sue each other. The lawyers argue it out. People steal. And then you find out the Chinese invented it 4,000 years
I was just going to
before.
say, or that it's happening in 4 different parts of the world, even though nobody was communicating with each other. That's really the fascinating part of that
Things
story.
come of age. Things come of
Yeah.
age, and then it happens.
Yeah.
So,
You've been listening to When the Biomass Hits the Wind Turbine with Jay and Annie Warmke, along with Adam Rich, our award-winning Emmy producer. Thank you for spending a bit of time with us. And as your grandmother probably told you, the secret to a happy and sustainable life is to...
Annie, play nice with others.
I'll try.
Clean up your own mess.
Sure.
Don't believe anything you ever hear. And eat your vegetables.
Of course. Thanks for
Till
being
next
with
time.
us.
Bye-bye.
Mother Earth will sing and her children will be healed. 'Cause I see the morning glory blossom in the night. I know the stars are dancing in the twilight. Soon we'll be together, all will be revealed. Mother Earth will sing and her children will be healed.
You can find more information on living sustainably in our unsustainable world at bluerockstation.com.